Okay, so you want to open a plasma donation center. Picture it, a clean storefront in a strip mall, flat-screen TVs bolted above the donor chairs, a line already forming outside before it opens at 8 a.m. It looks, from the parking lot, like a blood bank. It is not. It is a raw material extraction facility, and the raw material walks in on two legs, rolls up its sleeve, and leaves with a debit card. By the end of 2024, there were 1,234 of these facilities operating across the United States. A decade earlier, there were fewer than half that many. Here's the number that should stop you before we go any further. Plasma is now the 9th largest export category out of the United States by value. Bigger than coal, bigger than gold. In 2023, blood products brought the country $37 billion. Not blood, plasma, the pale yellow liquid left over once you spin the red cells out. And the United States alone supplies roughly 70% of the entire planet's plasma. There is a small mark on the inside of a donor's elbow, a bruise that fades, then reappears a few days later in almost the same spot. That mark is the actual origin point of a multi-billion-dollar export industry. Keep it in mind. We're going to come back to it. Walk into one of these centers on any given weekday, and the donor pool tells its own story. College students between classes, covering rent on a lease their financial aid doesn't stretch to. Gig workers between jobs, treating a donation appointment like a shift. People without health insurance, for whom $30 or $40 in cash today is worth more than the theoretical value of whatever their plasma eventually becomes. This industry doesn't advertise itself as targeting financial precarity. It doesn't need to. Precarity finds it on its own, because the entire business model depends on donors who show up not because they feel generous that day, but because they need the money that day. This isn't a hospital story, and it isn't really a charity story either, no matter how the waiting room posters are worded. It's a commodity story. And for once, the commodity is standing in line at 8 in the morning, filling out a form, waiting to be screened. The illusion is simple, and the industry doesn't discourage it. This is donating, with a little something for gas money. A nice thing you do on your lunch break. The reality is a global supply chain running through your forearm, and you are standing at the very first link of it, the cheapest link, by a wide margin. Here's how it actually moves, step by step. A donor sits down, gets connected to a centrifuge machine for roughly 90 minutes. Blood goes out, spins at high speed. Plasma gets drawn off, red blood cells get pumped back in. One visit produces around 800 milliliters, call it 3/4 of a liter, of raw plasma, logged, tested, and frozen before the donor has even left the parking lot. That plasma does not stay in the building. It gets boxed, kept below -20 degrees Celsius, and shipped, often straight across the Atlantic, to a fractionation plant. There, it's pooled together with plasma from thousands of other donors and broken apart into finished pharmaceutical products. Immune globulin, for people whose immune systems can't make enough antibodies on their own. Albumin, for burn and trauma and liver patients. Clotting factors, for people with hemophilia. For companies control almost this entire pipeline, from the folding chair to the finished vial. Grifols, CSL Behring, Takeda's BioLife, and Octapharma. Between them, they own an estimated 80% of the plasma collection centers operating in the United States. And here is the detail that surprises almost everyone outside the industry. Only 5 countries in the world supply roughly 80% of all the plasma used on the planet: the United States, Austria, the Czech Republic, Germany, and Hungary. All 5 of them pay their donors. Every country that has banned paying donors hasn't eliminated the plasma trade. It has simply become a customer of the 5 that didn't ban it. Austria, the Czech Republic, and Hungary don't get talked about the way the United States does in this conversation. But per capita, some of them run collection rates that rival or exceed the American system. Small countries, disproportionately large suppliers, all running on the same paid model. They're not outliers to the pattern. They're proof of it. Wherever payment is legal, volume follows, regardless of the size of the country doing the collecting. Canada is the clearest version of this. For years, Canadian Blood Services shut down its own unpaid collection routes because they were too expensive to run relative to what they brought in. Canada's surplus plasma got shipped south, processed into finished drugs by American and European fractionators, and shipped back north as pharmaceutical products Canadian patients then paid for. Meanwhile, Germany, which does allow paid donation, became one of the industry's single biggest customers anyway, because even a country with a strong voluntary donor culture cannot generate the volume that a for-profit, paid, twice-a-week collection model can. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a story about which country has more generous citizens. It's a structural fact about supply. Unpaid plasma collection, on its own, cannot meet global demand at current consumption levels. Paid collection can. So wherever it's legal to run a paid model, that model wins the volume, every time. And the frequency ceilings only make the gap wider. In the United States, a donor can legally give plasma up to 104 times a year, twice a week, every week. Germany, which also pays its donors, sets its own guideline noticeably lower than that. And most of the rest of Europe, following World Health Organization guidance, recommends a ceiling closer to 33 donations a year for the same body. 3 tiers, same biology, same finished product at the end of it, just a very different appetite for how hard the raw material can be worked. The safety argument against paying donors used to be straightforward. Paid donors, facing financial pressure, might hide a risk factor a screener would otherwise catch. A federal review of the industry found that risk is real but small. Plasma from paid donors tested marginally more likely to carry an undetected infection than plasma from volunteers, roughly 1 flagged unit in every 11,000 versus 1 in nearly 16,000 for volunteer plasma. But modern viral inactivation steps in fractionation now remove almost all of that gap by the time the product reaches a patient. Which means the one argument that might once have limited this industry on medical grounds has mostly stopped being the reason any country still bans it. So, you still want in. Here's the order the costs actually arrive in, and it is not the order most people expect. First, real estate. You need a facility big enough for donor beds, an on-site testing lab, cold storage, and a staff room, typically somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 square feet. And the location matters more than almost anything else in this business, because you need to reliably pull in 200 or more donors a day. That means you build near a college campus with cash-strapped students, near a lower-income neighborhood with a high concentration of gig workers and the uninsured, or, for the highest yield version of this entire model, within walking distance of a border crossing. Second, licensing. This is where most first-time operators stall out completely. You need FDA approval as a registered source plasma facility. If you also want to sell into the international market, and the international market is where the real money is, you need approval from the European Medicines Agency as well. Between filing the application and actually receiving your license, most operators wait somewhere between 9 and 12 months. During that entire window, you have a fully built, fully staffed, fully licensed with local authorities building generating zero revenue. Third, equipment. Automated plasmapheresis machines run somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000 apiece, multiplied by however many donor stations you're operating simultaneously. On top of that, you need validated donor management software, which, because it tracks medical eligibility and donation history, is itself regulated by the FDA as a medical device and has to pass its own approval process. Add walk-in freezers capable of holding product at -20 degrees Celsius around the clock, because a single power failure can destroy an entire quarantine batch. And because this is a facility regulated as both a medical clinic and a manufacturing site, you also need a full-time medical director, licensed phlebotomists, and a quality control staff large enough to pass unannounced inspections from the FDA at any point after your doors open. Not once, but on a recurring basis for as long as the center operates. None of this is optional, and none of it is negotiable down. A company can cut corners on marketing, on lobby furniture, on how nice the flat-screen TVs are. It cannot cut corners on the freezer temperature or the inspection paperwork, because the entire license, the one asset that actually makes the building worth anything, depends on passing every single one of those checks, every single time. Fourth, and this is the part nobody selling you the dream of passive income from a plasma center ever mentions, the inventory hold. Every single unit of plasma you collect has to sit frozen in quarantine for 60 days before it's even eligible to be sold, specifically so a lab can pull it back out of the pool if that donor later tests positive for something they didn't have signs of at the time of donation. Which means for 2 full months, you are paying rent, paying full staff salaries, and paying every donor who walks through the door, while not a single liter of what you're collecting has generated $1 of revenue yet. For scale, look at what real transactions in this space actually cost. In 2021, a specialty pharma company paid roughly $1.66 million just to acquire a single existing, already FDA-licensed plasma collection center in Texas, not to build one from scratch, to buy one that already had its license. Buying your way past the 9 to 12-month approval wait, in other words, has a real market price, and it's not a small one. A single well-located center at scale can be projected to bring in up to $10 million a year in revenue once it's running at full capacity, which tells you exactly why companies keep paying 7 figures just to skip the line. And the industry has been building at a pace that matches those numbers. U.S. plasma collections grew at roughly 12% a year between 2010 and 2019. The number of collection centers more than doubled in that same window, crossing 900 by 2020 and climbing past 1,200 by the end of 2024. This isn't a mature, slow-growth business. It's still in its land-grab phase. And underneath all 4 of those layers sits one more, quieter cost: donor acquisition. New donors are paid the richest bonuses in the entire system. In some promotions, more than $700 across their first 8 visits alone. That's not generosity. It's because a first-time donor is, statistically, the riskiest and least valuable donor a center can have. Repeat donors test cleaner over time. Fewer of their units get flagged and pulled from the pool during that 60-day hold. Which means when a company pays a donor, it isn't just buying 800 milliliters of plasma. It's buying that donor's clean track record, and that history is worth paying extra to build. Now put the 2 sides of this transaction next to each other, because this is where the entire business model becomes visible. One side: a company paying a donor somewhere between $30 and $70 per visit, twice a week if the donor is willing and eligible, up to 104 times a year under U.S. rules. That's more than triple the roughly 33 visit ceiling most of the rest of Europe recommends as a health guideline for the same donor's body. The other side: that same liter of plasma, once it clears quarantine and gets fractionated into finished pharmaceutical product, is worth somewhere around $400 to $500 on the open market. And in between those 2 numbers sits the company's actual cost to collect that liter in the first place: donor payment, staff labor, lab testing, overhead, which runs close to $150. $150 in, $400 to $500 out. The math barely needs a chart. But we're going to build the machine that runs on it anyway, because the collection center is only step 1. So where does the real money in this industry actually live? Not in the storefront. In the fractionation plant nobody films for the promotional brochure. Here's the mechanism. 1 liter of raw plasma doesn't turn into one product. It gets split across several: immune globulin, albumin, multiple clotting factors. Each one sold into its own separate market, at its own separate price, to its own separate population of patients. It's less like selling a carton of milk and more like refining a single barrel of crude oil into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. 3 different products, 3 different customers, 3 different margins, all extracted from the same starting liter. Grifols alone runs roughly 400 plasma collecting centers worldwide, processing an estimated 25% of the entire global plasma supply and holding close to 30% of the combined U.S. and European collection center market. That's one company, out of 4, controlling a quarter of the world's raw material, which is exactly the kind of concentration that lets a handful of fractionators set the terms for millions of individual donors who have no visibility into each other, let alone into the price the finished product eventually fetches. Take immune globulin, the single most valuable product in that split. It sells to hospitals and infusion clinics anywhere from $60 to well over $350 per gram, depending on the brand, the formulation, and the market. A patient with a chronic primary immune deficiency typically needs somewhere between 12 and 16 infusions a year for the rest of their life. Total annual treatment cost for that one patient, often north of $40,000. Now scale that up to a rarer, higher need condition. A single hemophilia patient's clotting factor, for a single year of treatment, can require plasma pooled from roughly 1,200 separate donations. 1,200 donations. One patient. 1 year. And demand for that finished product isn't slowing down. Better diagnostic tools mean more patients are being correctly identified with primary immune deficiencies that used to go undiagnosed for years. An aging population means more patients qualifying for albumin and immune therapies tied to age-related conditions. Every one of those new patients needs a supply chain that starts, ultimately, at a folding chair in a strip mall, which is exactly why the industry keeps opening new centers faster than most people even notice they exist. That's the actual shape of this industry. Once you strip away the storefront, millions of 90-minute visits, paid $30 to $70 at a time, quietly feeding a small number of fractionation plants that convert that raw material into a global finished drug market worth close to $36 billion right now. And, on current growth projections, headed toward nearly $80 billion within the next decade, driven by an aging population and rising rates of diagnosed immune and bleeding disorders. The donor sees the storefront and the debit card. The patient sees a hospital bill with too many zeros on it. Almost nobody in either group ever sees the plant standing in between, and that plant is exactly where the margin lives. And as we're about to see, this entire machine doesn't just depend on donors showing up in general. It depends on one very specific kind of donor showing up, in very specific numbers, in very specific places, which makes this supply chain a good deal more fragile than any balance sheet lets on. For years, the major plasma companies quietly built dozens of collection centers within a few blocks of the U.S. Mexico border, in towns like El Paso and Eagle Pass, Texas, specifically to draw in daily crossers. Mexican donors, some earning the rough equivalent of $9 a day back home, could cross legally on a visitor visa, donate twice a week, and take home close to $400 a month, nearly triple what many of them could earn locally. At the industry's peak, Mexican nationals were estimated to account for roughly 10% of all plasma collected inside the United States. Then, on June 15, 2021, U.S. Customs and Border Protection announced, with no advance warning to the plasma industry and effective immediately, that donating plasma for compensation no longer counted as an activity permitted for visitors holding B-1 business or B-2 tourist visas. Overnight, the daily lines of donors that centers along the border had been built to serve simply stopped crossing. Centers constructed specifically around that donor pool went quiet within days. One customs official based in Eagle Pass later estimated that even during the tightest pandemic-era travel restrictions, somewhere between 300 and 400 people a day had still been finding ways to cross specifically for plasma money. And now, on paper, that door was closed everywhere, all at once, with no transition period. For the donors themselves, this wasn't an abstract supply chain event. It was a household budget event. One regular donor from Ciudad Juarez, who'd crossed into El Paso twice a week for 2 years straight, had built roughly $400 a month of income around those visits. Enough, he said, to cover his truck payment, his utility bills, and school costs for his 2 kids. When the ban hit, that income didn't shrink. It went to zero, on a policy timeline set thousands of miles away, with no say from anyone actually standing in the donor line. The policy held for 15 months. Donors who had built a stable weekly income around it lost that income in a single announcement, with no notice and no appeal. Then, on September 19, 2022, a U.S. District Court granted a preliminary injunction blocking Customs and Border Protection from continuing to enforce the ban, after plasma industry groups and patient advocacy organizations sued jointly to overturn it. The border reopened. The centers refilled. The supply came back to roughly where it had been. But it didn't come back because the underlying economics of the industry had changed in any way. It came back because a single federal agency's enforcement memo, contested in a single courtroom, had been the only thing standing between this entire model and a structural hole in its own raw material supply. Not every collapse in this industry happens down at the collection end, where the donors are. Some happen at the very top of the pyramid, at the fractionating companies themselves. On January 9, 2024, Gotham City Research, an activist short-selling research firm, published a report accusing Grifols, one of the four companies that dominate this entire global pipeline of concealing the true scale of its debt through a web of transactions with a separate company linked to its own founding family. Grifols shares opened that day down as much as 43%. By the close of trading that week, the stock had lost nearly 40% of its value, the worst single week in the company's history on record, wiping out more than $3 billion in market capitalization in a matter of days. Grifols categorically denied the allegations, called the report false and speculative, and filed suit against the short seller. Two very different collapses in the same industry within a few years of each other. One triggered by a single government enforcement memo at a border checkpoint. The other triggered by a single research report from a hedge fund analyst thousands of miles from any donation chair. Neither collapse had anything to do with whether the world still needed the medicine. Demand for immune globulin and clotting factor never dropped for a single day during either event. Both collapses had everything to do with how thin the margin for error is at each end of this pipeline. Fragile at the collection end, where it depends on one specific vulnerable population showing up daily, and fragile at the capital end, where a single accounting allegation can erase billions before lunch. Here's the pattern. Once you strip the sympathy and the outrage out of it, and just look at where the risk and the reward actually land. The donor takes on the entire physical cost of this transaction, the needle mark on the inside of the elbow, the fatigue that frequent donors report, the 90 minutes surrendered twice a week, and gets compensated in cash, up front, at a flat rate that does not move no matter what the finished product eventually sells for downstream. The fractionator takes on almost none of that physical cost and captures nearly all of the pricing power because they are not selling plasma at all. They are selling a patented, FDA-approved pharmaceutical product that a hospital, in most cases, has no real substitute for. CSL Behring alone, just one of the four dominant fractionators, reported more than $10 billion in annual revenue. While the donor is paid a flat per-visit rate that hasn't meaningfully changed shape in over a decade, the fractionator is selling a product whose price, per gram, keeps climbing year over year, tracking an aging population and rising rates of diagnosed chronic illness. Trends the donor has absolutely no exposure to, upside or down. Run the two balance sheets side by side, and the asymmetry gets even sharper. A donor who gives the legal maximum, 104 times a year, at an average of maybe $50 a visit, tops out around $5,200 annually, before factoring in what frequent donation may cost their own body over time. A single immune deficiency patient's annual treatment, drawing on product from dozens of donors just like that one, already costs more than $40,000. The dollar that changes hands at the folding chair and the dollar that changes hands at the hospital billing desk are, technically, tied to the same liter of plasma. They are not remotely the same size. This is the same asset-light pattern that shows up across almost every industry in this series, just wearing a different uniform. Whoever holds the license, the patent, or, in this specific case, the FDA approval and the fractionation plant standing between raw material and finished drug sits furthest away from the physical risk and closest to the pricing power. The person physically closest to the actual product, the one whose body the product literally comes from, is almost never the one who gets to price it. So here's where that leaves the number we open with. $37 billion a year in exports. Built, almost entirely, on 90-minute visits, paid $30 to $70 at a time, by people who live close enough to a border or close enough to a paycheck gap to actually need that money on the same day they walk in. Within that system, in fairness, nearly everyone gets something real. Patients get medicine that, for many of the rarest conditions, would simply not exist at any price without a paid, industrial-scale donor pool. Donors get cash today that they would not otherwise have. Companies capture a margin that almost nobody sitting in that donor chair will ever see or understand. Remember that mark on the inside of the elbow from the start of this video, the bruise that fades and reappears in almost the same spot, twice a week, 104 times a year. That mark doesn't show up on any balance sheet. It doesn't appear in the $37 billion export figure, or in CSL Behring's annual report, or in a single line of Grifols' financial statements. It only shows up on one place, the donor's own arm. Everyone else in this chain, the fractionator, the hospital, the insurance company, deals in numbers. Only the donor deals in the actual, physical raw material. The question isn't really whether the system works. Clearly, in its own terms, it does. The question is whether it works, and it's fair, we're ever supposed to mean the same thing here. And the second question, the one that's meant to follow you out of this video, past the parking lot, past the next time you drive by one of those 1,234 storefronts, is this. If the raw material for a $37 billion export industry walks in on two legs and rolls up its sleeve, whose body is actually being priced? And who, exactly, got to set that price?